Hello and welcome to this short introduction of Modo, where I intend to go through all the basics of the program, where to find things, how the interface works, a brief overview of the tools, how Modo works in general, touching upon some of the basic features for modeling and rendering. I don't intend to go in depth into a lot of things, but just keeping it pretty high level and just go through everything you need to get started in Modo, basically. I will not be going into detail on things like hotkeys, how the specific tools work in detail. We'll leave that for later. This tutorial is aimed at Modo 9 forward. Most of the things carry over between the different Modo versions, but there are some interface differences in Modo 9 compared to Modo 8 and earlier versions. I will start with going through the layout and the interface of Modo, and then moving on to navigation and preferences, then on to the how to create primitives and work with layers, and then selection, modeling tools, UV tools, rendering and baking basics. Just to give a really quick overview of the different components that you need from a modeling and rendering standpoint. This is pretty much all my opinions on how Modo work. I am pretty sure I will miss a lot of things that other people find useful. This is more the things that I use on a day-to-day basis as a modeler primarily. That being said, let's get started. So, in the default Modo viewport, this is like the default that you will have the first time you start Modo. The first thing that you can note is that Modo has an entirely modular interface. Every single element is a module, like this section here is one, this here is one module, which makes it very powerful if you want to customize it. So it's very easy to detach and change the interface, detach modules into new windows. Very handy if you like working with two screens, like to have a very customized interface with like a secondary screen with different information or rendering windows and so on. So in the default interface you have the different layouts here that you can choose between, and here you have the different selection modes, some different options for symmetry, action centers, fall-offs, snapping, and so on. Over here you have tools menu, the different tools which we will go through later. Over here you have the item list, which is very important, and then the shader tree for rendering, and groups list, and also a resource list of the different images that you have loaded. Over here you have lists of UV maps, morph maps, and other maps, as well as properties. When you have something selected, like a layer, for example, you have the properties of that layer here with its own subtabs. And here you have statistics, which is good if you want to sort and select things by vertex or type or material and so on. It's can be pretty handy if you need to do like some very specific and detailed selection and so on, or just keep track of finding things like n-gons or things without materials or incorrect materials and so on, or selection by smoothing groups, etc. So that's generally what I use the statistics for. And you also have this info part here, which I almost never use actually. Down here you have the command history. If it's collapsed, it looks like this. Drag this up, you have the command history, which is very handy to have, especially when making hotkeys. And down here you have the command line where you can run different commands and scripts and so on. So and of course you have the standard menu up here. And that's the basic interface. And up here you have different layouts for different modes. For example, topology mode, which has a different layout and some different tools exposed here. And UV edit mode, paint mode, layout mode for scene setup stuff. Oh, that's it, setup. The animation mode, render, the render view, scripting, and then the mesh fusion view, which is standard in 901, but in 801 earlier you need to buy mesh fusion to have schematic fusion. And you can control tab between these different views. I generally stick to the model view. The good thing about having a modular interface is that you can create your own layouts or adapt the layouts to your needs, so you might actually not need to switch between all of these. If you want to, you can set up your own more optimized ones. For example, when I'm dealing with an animated mesh, for example a mech that is falling into something, or I need to check how the animation works, I usually add an animation bar in the model view, so I can scrub the animation timeline back and forward without having to go to the animation view and so on, which can be pretty handy. One drawback of having this modular interface where you can edit everything and you can drag things around is that it's very easy for, especially for beginners, to break the interface and then accidentally save that. So they, for example, they lose a part of the interface and don't know how to get it back. And the emergency way of fixing that is when you break something in Modo, when you close Modo, that's when the config saves. So if you actually kill the Modo process, you won't save the config. So if you're a beginner and you accidentally, remove the model window or the tool statistics, and then don't know how to get it back, it's safer to just kill the process for Modo, and then you start it up again and it should be back. So that's also something that's pretty useful to know in general. It's that unless you save the config manually, which you can do up here in the config save in the menu, if Modo crashes when you have been, for example, creating your own interface or setting lots of hotkeys, if it crashes, you will lose everything you have done with the Modo setup. So if you're setting lots of hotkeys or creating an interface setup, make sure to save your config, otherwise you risk losing it. There's nothing worse than creating tons of hotkeys and you sit there and you use them and you get used to them, and then Modo crashes, and the next time you start it up they are all gone and you have to redo all of it. In order to configure the interface, what you can do is that you can hold the mouse over this tiny little orange thing, the viewport widget, and here you have the controls for the layout. For example, you can have different settings, and here you can do things like you can duplicate, copy, detach, or split the interface. So for example, you can duplicate it, so you have two here, and then you can detach that one. So now you actually have a detached copy of this element, for example. So if I create something, so now I have a second copy of this. So if you want to, this is basically if you want to create a secondary window layout, for example, you can start like this, and you can cut it up into pieces, move things around, detach them. For example, if we duplicate this, and you can just drag it around, you can see how the orange highlight here shows where we can put it. So for example, if we want to duplicate this one and then split it vertically. And then we want to change what kind of window this is. We have different options here, like a 3D model view. So now we actually have a tiny model view here. We can rearrange these. And it's very simple but powerful. And of course, when you're doing a bit more complicated stuff, you can do things like your own button layouts and all that stuff. But at least that's the very basics of how it works. You can duplicate, detach, delete parts. If you grab here, you can just move them around freely in the interface like this. Very simple to rearrange things the way you want them to. I generally don't rearrange the interface all that much because I don't touch the buttons a lot, since I have most of the things hotkeys that I need. But for someone who is using a lot more broader aspect of the program, where they're using a lot more of the rendering tools and the animation tools and so on, I can imagine that it's pretty handy to create your own customized interfaces where you have all the things that you need for different situations. And that's the basics of the interface in Modo. The navigation in Modo is different from other 3D programs. All 3D programs have their own navigation keys. But the good thing is that you can customize these. So in Preferences menu, it's here, you have the input, and here you have some different settings, and under remapping you have the mouse input preset, where you can change to Maya Navigation, 3D Studio Max, and so on. So I would recommend keeping it as standard input and just getting used to that. But if you want to, you can change the navigation. I know that it has caused some issues for some people, where there are certain handy presets in Modo with how to create things and so on, where the navigation inputs from other programs actually interfere with these things. Like, for example, you have tools where you can use the shift and the alt and the middle mouse key to do certain things, and if you have a different control input, that overrides how the tools work, so you actually can't access those functions without rekeying them and so on. So I would recommend sticking to the default one and just power through, but if you want to, you can just change it to whatever you want. Another thing that many people find a bit broken in Modo when they first started is that how the copy paste works. And it's that the default copy paste is that when you copy paste something, you actually don't select what you just pasted in. You still have the original copy selected, which is kind of annoying if you're copying a part of a mesh and you want the one you pasted in selected, so you can just move that. And you can actually change this default. The options for that is here in the mesh items. You have the copy and paste. You can select pasted elements and it will select like most people would expect it to. Another thing that people often complain about is the trackball rotation mode in the viewport, and this is also something that you can turn off globally. You can either turn it on and off per viewport, or you can just globally turn it off. And here you have the viewport rotation. By default, the trackball rotation is on, which you can just turn off. And those are the main complaints that I hear from people who come from other 3D applications, but luckily those are easily fixed. And of course there's all the other settings in here, like the autosave and things like the maximum texture resolution displayed and all that stuff, which you might want to turn up from the default, which is 2K textures, which is really small. But I still have it on 2K. So that covers the basics of the navigation and where to find things, and let's move on to the cool stuff. Now that we have looked at the interface and where to find things, let's do some stuff. So to create primitives in Modo, you have them here in the basic tab in the model view, and here you have the different primitives. And if you hold the mouse, click the mouse and hold, you have some different ones: the capsule, arc, the solid sketch tool, and so on. So these are all the basic primitives, and the default is just to click first for one axis and then for the next one. So that's the default creation mode. If you use the control key when you drag something out, you will create a uniform size. So for example, if you want to create a perfectly round sphere or so, and if you use the shift key and press here, you will create a new item with that primitive in it. Delete that. And another trick is that if you create an item and you want to launch the same command again, you can just press shift and then drag out another one. This works with all the tools. For example, if you're doing lots of cuts and so on, and you want to create lots of cuts, you can just press the shift key and then just keep cutting, for example. Another thing that you can do is that if you hold the right mouse button and drag, you can create you can change how many segments it has, and this goes for all the different tools. For example, the sphere, you can just quickly drag. Here in the corner you have the tool options, where you can set things like the radius, the position, and the number of sides and segments and so on, and different options. For example, spheres, you have globe, quad, ball, tessellated sphere. Same goes for like cubes. You have the segments and the size and so on. So Modo works with items. So now all of these polygons are in one item here called mesh, and when you create at least complex models, you want to divide them into multiple items, and there are several reasons why you want to do that. One of the reasons is performance, because Modo has pretty bad performance when it comes to the amount of polygons that you have. Doesn't matter if they're like, if you have millions of sub-D polygons, that's fine, but the actual editable vertices really eats performance in Modo. It's one of Modo's weaknesses, is the amount of editable vertices per layer or per item that you're in. So when you're doing complex models, you do want to split it up into several items, and there are more reasons to do that, because you can do a lot of things like mirroring and instancing and so on easier with when split into different items, and it also makes selection easier. But for some people that come from other programs, this sometimes is hard to wrap your head around, because you don't want to end up with a list of like 100 items. It's like if I create lots of items like this, and lots of them are empty, and some of them only have like one tiny thing in them. I always try to keep it pretty structured and naming them so it makes sense. For example, you can go into the properties here for each mesh item, which has a ton of properties. I will not go into detail on these. It has things like different morph influences and smoothing, and what the subdivision level it will have by default in the both the Catmull Clark and the subdivision. All these different options. But you can also set the name here. For example, this is called cylinder. You can also rename them from here by renaming them. Just derp. Sometimes, if you're lucky, it will highlight the text and you can actually rename it. Like there. It's not 100% reliable though, so I have a hotkey for that instead. And something that can sometimes confuse things for people is that every item has its own scale, rotation, and position. Which, if you're just modeling something, you want to keep all of this, neutral, because you don't want to have something that is actually scaled down, because then that will mess with some tools. Because it can be powerful if you're creating something with a lot of instances and you want some smaller instances, or you're animating something, then that's very powerful. But you want, for just strictly modeling something, you want to keep it organized with as few layers as possible, but very clean, and but not so few that you get bad performance. And you also don't want to have like different rotational and scale values on the separate items, because if you would then reset it, everything will just move around. And also certain tools and scripts that you might download, sometimes depending on that the items are actually frozen like with zero rotation and movement and scale, because if they take that into account, you want, for example, to place an object next to this one, and modo thinks that it's actually over here, but since it's scaled down, it's there, but modo will show it over there. So the safest is just to keep it on zero. Another trick, if you are for example creating a cube and you want to have a certain value like 50 meters, and you can press Control Enter and it will assign that value to all of these. You can also do that by pressing the symbol here, but Control Enter is cooler because it's fast. Another reason to work with layers is that you can create instances, and you can do that by right clicking here, and then now I have tons of stuff here which most people don't have because I have some custom stuff, but you can instance something here, and then you have an instance of that mesh, and then you can, for example, edit the values on this one, for example -100%. Now we have an instance of this in X. The good thing about using instances instead of mirroring is that, first of all, it's cheaper on the file size because it's not actual geometry, and it's also very cheap to render. So I try to use instances as much as possible because it's just faster, and it just saves performance and memory and time. Another reason to work with items is if you're doing something that is animated, for example. It's very easy to animate separate items in Modo without, rigging or skinning or something. You can just animate the items, but then you need to have like a pretty structured scene setup. And another thing that I use a lot to keep scenes clean is, for example, say that this was the high poly of an object. Select all of these, shift click, and then I can group them. Right click and then just parent to group locator, and everything is in one group here, collapsed. and then you can just rename this like high poly, for example. And then you can use the eyes here just to toggle the visibility, for example, of different things, which is good if you have like a high poly, low poly, and you need to toggle the visibility of the different elements. It's nice to put them in groups so you can just toggle them on and off. You don't need to use groups to parent things to each other. You can just drag something like this, and now this one is parented to the cylinder. This is also how you create very simple animation parenting. For example, if you want to have one part that is parented to another, you can just drag it under here and it will be parented. So that kind of simple animation and scene setup is very easy to you have a robot, and you want to parent the arm to the torso, and the torso is parented to the legs, I don't know, and then all of it is in one big group. It's very, very easy to set up. That's pretty much how the primitive creation and the layers works. It's also good to note that you can only work in the layer that you have selected. So where you have this layer selected, you can only work with these polygons, like you cannot touch anything else, which is why the performance is cheaper with many layers. To select another layer, you have to use the item selection mode and select that layer, and then you can use that. Or you can just select them all here, and then all of them are editable at once. Now that we have created our beautiful cubes and we want to select things, we can go through how the different selection modes work in Modo. You have the vertex, edge, and polygon selection mode, which are pretty self-explanatory. Verts, edges, polygons. So that's for selecting the different elements. And then you have the item selection mode, where you can select different items. You also have the material selection mode, but since I only have one material in this scene, it doesn't really do much right now. But yeah, it can be pretty handy. Modo has a lot of handy selection features by default. For example, you can select the loops and the rings, which is pretty handy. Like this. The thing is that if you I'm gonna add some more segments here. If you want to select several rings, you can either do it like this, for example, and then add another one, and it will always run command on all the new ones you have started. So for example, if you want to add another one, you can just do that like that. To double click to just select all the continuous selection. Just double click something, and the same thing is there. If you select a few polygons here, a few polygons there, and then double click, it will select all of it. So if you, for example, would like to select this one and a loop from this one, you can't, for example, select the loop here and then do that by default, because then it will increase this selection to the entire thing as well. So, but if you just do it like this and then the ring, that works fine. There are of course custom scripts and so on for this kind of thing, like that, for example. But by default, that's not possible. So if we go to edge selection and we select, for example, here we can select the if we go to edge selection here, if we have this one selected, for example, we can select both the ring or the loop. To make a selection pattern, you just select one, and then Modo will read. For example, here you can just increase selection, or if you create like every second one, you can just select that as well. And the default key for this, I think, is up and down, just a step like this. And this works in all the different selection modes. And it always reads between the last selected polygon. So if you do like something like this, and then you're like, oh wait, I want to select this ring, you can just do that, and then it will just do that. So we'll always just read between the last two selected polygons, verts, or edges. When you're in the edge selection mode, double clicking does not select the entire continuous mesh, it just selects the loop. And you just press shift to select more. And the same thing it is here. So if you're selecting like this, and now you just want to let's do it like this, for example, it will just select those loops like that. There's also a couple of different selection conversion tools. For example, if you hold Alt, you can convert it selection, convert it to edges or vertices. There's also the boundary edge. If you hold Control, you can select the boundary edges, which can be pretty handy. For example, if you have a model that you have mirrored, and you need to find if there are any holes in it, for example, you can just select the entire thing and then just find the boundary edges. Now this one doesn't have any, but for example, this one would have been like a really tiny hole. We'll look for the boundary edges, and then we'll find them. So that's pretty handy. I use that one a lot. You can also grow the selections by I don't know what the default keys are, because it's been so long since I used them, but I think it's Shift and Up key. By default, but I'm not sure. It's been so long since I used the defaults. But that's handy just for the growing the selection. And one good thing about this is that you can then shrink the selection again. Something I do a lot is, for example, if you don't want to be bothered to select all the polygons for something like this, and you do something like that, but you don't want to select everything, and then you just increase the selection, and then you can decrease it again, because since it has filled in all the blanks in the selection, it doesn't deselect this again. So it's pretty handy for doing stuff like that. I just expand the selection until it fills in all the holes, and then I just contract it again to have the part that I actually wanted. So let's move on to the gizmo. The gizmo is pretty self-explanatory. You have the gizmo here, and you have 3 different axis constraint controls here. And then in the middle you have whichever axis you're in. And if that's in the rotate, it's like all 3 axes. For example, if we do this, it's just uniform scale. And if you use the rotate one, you also have a view dependent rotation as well on top of the other ones. And if you click outside the cylinder, this is where you will change the center to. For example, for rotation as well. And what it does when you are clicking outside like this is that it's actually changing the action center. And action centers is something that is really useful in Modo. You have them here. The standard one, like by default, is automatic, and then you have some different ones like selection border, origin, parent, local. The ones I use the most are probably the automatic one, the selection one, the local one, and the origin one. they're all pretty self-explanatory, but they're pretty handy. Pop-up menu for them here, for example. So if you want to scale something from the origin, or if you have something and you want to move it in the selection aligned axis, you have it here. So those are pretty handy. Use those a lot. So definitely try those out. And another way to reach a similar result is that you can use the work plane. And you can the work plane is basically this one. It's on by default, but you can toggle it off in the viewport options. So you can align the work plane to, for example, align the work plane to selection like this, which is pretty handy. Then you can create, for example, cube and move it around like if it was on the default axis, because it's basically changed the default axis to be aligned to the selection. So this is pretty handy if you're working, for example, with a sloped plane and you want to work with things as if it was the floor, and just move things along it. Then you can just align the work plane. I don't use the work plane nearly as much as I should because I'm lazy, but it's a really powerful tool. And when you're done, you can just reset it. And you can see that the work plane is shifting depending on which axis is active. You can also see it down here in the corner, which two axes that are active right now. And when it comes to the action centers, if you use the automatic one like this, you can also use that in combination with the snapping tools. So you can snap it to a vertex, for example, so that you can, for example, if you want to rotate everything around this point, for example, you can turn on the snapping like that, for example. So it's pretty handy for people who do a lot of grid-based work, which I don't do either because I'm lazy with the grid as well. Modo has a pretty good selection of snapping tools. They're also I'm not going to go in depth into those, but just turn it on here, and then you have the different snapping options here, and you can create presets and a lot of different controls, but they're pretty self-explanatory what you want to snap to and so on. But if you just want to toggle it off, it's just has a toggle button here. You might have noticed that I'm not talking about which hotkeys different tools use, and that's because I'm not using the default ones, and I highly recommend anyone who are serious about their hotkeys to make their own, because the ones that are in Modo by default are functional, but they're in no way thought through from a modeling standpoint. So, for example, if you want to create your own hotkey, you just find the tool you just used, for example, or the action you want to map to a hotkey, and you just find here in the history, and you right click it and map command to key, and you will see which key it's currently mapped to, and for example you want to put it on R, and then you will see what the tool is currently assigned to that is. And then you just save the config file and it's saved. If you do put custom hotkeys for something, you will see them displayed next to the tool here. So here you have the different hotkeys that are set, for example. And the different modeling tools are divided up into several tabs. The basic ones are the basic primitives and the rotate, scale, move tools, the some snaps and precisions, and then bevel, extrude, bridge, a few tools, some of the more basic ones. And the other categories, deform is different deform tools, of course. For example, we have the element move, which is pretty handy. It's a soft move, the fall off. You can set the fall off like this. It's pretty handy if you're doing lots of soft modeling. Pretty handy for bending and warping stuff. Then there's like, some of them are pretty self-explanatory, some of them are pretty, well, strange and not as useful. Like, I personally don't use the soft move and soft drag so much. I don't use the smooth one either so much. It's good if you need to smooth out some geo, but I don't find it all that useful. And the thing is that these tools, I'm not sure, no, get to that later. And the twist, bend, vortex and swirl tools, they do what you would assume them to do. Like the bend tool, you have the influence of the bend, and then you just bend stuff. The duplicate tools, I'll drag this down. These ones have a few special attributes. For example, if you're holding the Alt key, you will see that it switches a lot of the tools to instancing tools. This is pretty handy. For example, if you want to clone something, you have the instance clone, so you can create instance mesh clones. So that one's pretty cool. Or for example, the instance array, I use that one a lot. The instance radial array especially. It's also very handy. So that just deals with the item that you have selected instead of the normal polygon version. And you can also access them just by clicking here, holding down. The mesh edit tools, there's a lot of different slice tools, as well as bevel and extrude. Tack tool is a very useful tool that I don't personally use that a lot because I have scripts that emulate the same thing, but it's pretty handy. What it does is that it can tack your selection onto the surface, and you have different alignment options for it. For for example, if you have an edge selection, it uses that as the work plane, which is great if you're making things like rivets and bolts and so on. You can use this one for that. It also has some boolean and drill tools, as well as mesh cleanup, which is very handy if you are a sloppy modeler and are not doing things correctly. The vertex, edge and polygon menus have vertex, edge and polygon specific tools. You're not necessarily in polygon or vertex and edge mode when you're using them, but I do recommend that you look them through and find what's useful for you. There are a lot of tools that I don't use, or that I use other tools that are modified to work the same way. So a lot of the tools have quite similar functionality, which you can replicate in other ways instead of using the different tools. So Some of it is just a case of me being a bit lazy, and I should look closer at this tools, because there's quite a lot of stuff in there. But you really need to look closer on the tools yourself and just see which one does what you want, because there's a lot of the tools that, it works a certain way, and what you actually wanted was something slightly different, but there might be another tool that actually makes that. There are also tools that are not really displayed here. For example, when you're in topology mode, you have like a different set of tools here. It's like they are almost all of them are available in other places, but some of them are specific for the topology set. And also for modo 9, you have the mesh fusion palette here, which has all the specific tools for the new mesh fusion, and those are pretty specific for mesh fusion, all of them, so you can just ignore those. There are actually a few issues with, for example, the mirroring that Modo has that I know a lot of people have problems with. And for example, if we turn on symmetry in x-axis, something like this, there are, now everything works fine. We have the mirroring, works fine, but there are certain cases where the mirroring breaks, and it's most of the time it's actually pretty easy to predict where it will break. It's just that if you're not aware of the specific cases, it might be confusing. For example, if we put this polygon in X, so now we have basically two boxes like this, but they are both now in X here with this polygon snapped to the X-axis. Now the mirroring is broken. Still works on this polygon, but for all the polygons that are touching here, it's broken. If we delete these polygons, or if we just merge this and then delete these polygons, still not working. Why? I do not know. But if we would turn off the symmetry and then just mirror this over, then it works fine. So this is one of the cases where mirroring can break for no apparent reason. So that is one of the cases where it can get really annoying. But in general, Modo has got a lot better at handling the mirroring. Another thing that might break the mirroring is that if you do something so that it actually breaks the mirroring by doing something on one side, there's not mirror on the other side, that will break the mirroring. But the problem is that should not happen when you have the symmetry active, because it should just work on both sides. The problem is that if you do certain things in this crucial area around the axis, it's possible to break the mirroring. For example, sometimes when you do this, you select an edge here, and sometimes you will get like an inverted loop on each side. It's hard to reproduce when you want it, of course, but sometimes that happens, and then you have to watch out, because that's something that can break the mirroring. Other than that, it's pretty functional and doesn't break all that much. Another thing that is kind of hidden away is that you have two different subdivision modes in Modo, and that's the normal subdivision and the Kaplan-Clark subdivision. So toggle something into sub D by just pressing tab. But to toggle Kaplan-Clark subdivision, you press shift tab. And this is something you notice mostly when you have just the edge weighting. Because if you have the normal standard subdivisions, you will get lots of artifacts, which you won't get in the Kaplan-Clark. Sometimes it's a bit messy to keep track of which is which, because they kind of look the same, and there's, with all the cages turned off and so on, there's no visual indicator to which one you're using. But then that's when it's good to have the statistics here, because you can select things by the normal subdivs or the Kaplan-Clark ones. So tab and shift tab. You also have access to a lot of the tools, if not all of them, here in the menus, where you also have some things that are not visible in the interface. For example, you have the polygon tags and smoothing groups, for example, and selection sets I don't think are visible in this interface as well. So it's worth exploring both these menus and these menus, because they don't contain exactly the same things. These are the primarily used tools, but here there's quite a lot of good stuff as well. And that's the basics of the modeling tools. Now that we have looked at the modeling tools, let's look at some of the basic UV mapping tools. Go to UV edit here, and you'll see that we already have a very wonky UV map. Every time you create a primitive, by default it already has UVs, which is great sometimes and annoying sometimes. If you're making a large high poly model with lots of base primitives, and when you look at the UV maps list, you'll probably have sometimes up to 10-15 UV maps, and they are filled with random crap data basically. And sometimes it's very good to just clean that up and just delete them, because that will save you a lot of file size, and saving will be quicker, loading will be quicker, because sometimes up to 50% of the file size can be from all the junk UVs that you've created. The good thing about these UVs that are created is if you're, for example, creating cables or something, and you're creating something like this. You have a cable here using the tube tool, and it already has UVs. So all you need to do is scale these, and you have UVs. So if you're, for example, creating something with lots of tubes and cables, and been created using guides and the tube tool, for example, all of it is basically unwrapped already. So then it's not so good to delete those maybe, but it's very handy when you are, for example, just quickly blocking out something in low poly, and you just basically have basic UVs already. But if you're going to do lots of modeling on the parts, you probably just want to delete the UVs, because they just create a lot of junk data. So the UV tools, let's delete this and just create some kind of broken thing here. There we go. So now we have some very broken UVs here, and here you have a few useful tools like show distortion, where you can basically show the textile density and the distortion of the UVs. I use this all the time instead of a UV grid, for quick UVs because it gives you all the information you need. And so I'm just gonna delete these UVs so we can start from scratch. And there are a few useful UV tools that I rely on the most, and it's the unwrap tool, which is here, and the relax tool, as well as the UV projection tool for just creating the base UVs. The unwrap tool basically takes your edge selection and uses that as lines to cut. So for example, if we do something like this, and unwrap, we would get this. And we'll also see the distortion, like the blue means it's bigger, red means it's smaller and more deformed, and green means it's average pixel density. So that's pretty handy. And also here you have things like show overlap, the polygons should be filled or not, and a whole bunch of settings. You can use the zoo tools, something I use a lot as well. So for example here, just take the whole thing and just move it. Okay, this is not very good unwrap, but you get the point. For example, like that. There's also the relax tools. You relax, which has the different modes: conformal, adaptive. Often use the adaptive one with the area weight pretty high. I mean, you get more. It doesn't respect the UVs as much, like the polygon shape, but it creates a more even pixel density and deformation, which is handy if you're doing some larger, softer UVs where it's not as important to have perfectly square polygons. For example, you can use that one quite aggressively to just relax and just increase the iterations, and that's usually good enough. And then of course you have things like the packed UVs, which can pack, orient and stretch your UVs. So for example, if you have things that are very uneven pixel density, and it will just scale them so everything has a uniform pixel density, which is quite handy if you're having, you know, an object and you're just like doing crappy UVs and you don't care about how big they are, and then you can just pack them and scale them. And basically it's the more UV islands you have, the more complex the UV map is, the more effective the pack tool is, because it will I found it that if you compare to what you can realistically achieve when you're packing it yourself versus what the tool does, it's on more complex UVs, it's around 90% of the surface area that you will get from hand packing it. So that's pretty handy. And that's the basics of the UV tools. You also have some, you know, standard stuff that like UV projection, you know, planar projection from different sides. And you can, you know, set the automatic or manual settings, and you know how big the projection should be and what axis. But you know, it's not rocket science. So a good thing with the UV distortion is that if you're using it like this, you can actually display it on the model, because you can select the vertex map in the display, and you can select your in other maps you have UV distortion, so then you can actually get a visual representation of what your UVs are like. So for example, if you have some polygons that, you know, like this, you will now see that they are distorted. It's pretty handy. It's not quite the same as having a checker picture, but it does the job in a different way. Once you have UV mapped something, there are several ways you can bake something to an object. So we're going to start with looking at how the basic rendering works. So if you go to the render tab here in the middle you have a preview renderer. You can just focus the camera on the object, and here you have a bunch of different settings. By default it's just showing the color output. You can select here which output you want to see, if you want to see the alpha or final color, so on. Here in the render, the shader tree, you have the different render outputs with different settings here, for example. And here you have the render node. This is where you set things like the bake size, width and height, and the render size. It also has a lot of different settings, for like the different kinds of anti-aliasing and the like how many samples. You also have the different reflection and refraction depth. They're by default at 8. I usually turn those down to much lower number because it speeds up rendering a lot if you're doing things with reflections and so on. And most of the time you don't really need 8 reflection depth bounces. You also have the different settings for global illumination, which is by default on, and so on. And here you have the different, different render outputs, and you can just add new ones here by using this add layer here. See where the render outputs is just down here. You can also just right click here and change what kind it is. For example, we can change the alpha to a ambient occlusion one. We can duplicate it, change it to an ambient occlusion one, for example, and then we can look at it here. It's not very amazing ambient occlusion, but there it is. So now if we would render, so here's the render window, and you have the different outputs here, the drop down menu, and you can save them either as separate images or as layered images, so you just get everything as one PSD, which is handy if you're using a lot of different render outputs. This is one way to render ambient occlusion. There is another way, which is better for people who are doing game art, which has lots of floaters and so on, and that is to use the occlusion node in Modo instead. So you can add one here, occlusion, and this is, we'll go to the final color output here. We can just change the settings here, the distance and so on. Let's just set that to like 50 meters, and then spread angle to 170 degrees. And then if we set these to for example, diffuse coefficient, so we'll only get the diffuse information, we'll get an ambient occlusion. And the thing is that this one does not cast incorrect shadows from floaters. You'll get an accurate ambient occlusion from floaters, and it's easier to control than the more correct ambient occlusion rendering output. So if you're doing something with floaters, it's better to use, like, set this up and have an occlusion node to bake things out. And there's 2 ways that you can bake something out. Either you just use render and they have bake from object to render outputs, and that will bake with a distance, or a cage, which is good if you're baking from a high to low, for example. And you will get, oh wait, probably forgot to, yeah, of course now I couldn't bake out because I didn't have anything to bake from, but let's see if we can fix that. There, for example. Right, now I can bake from object to render output, and we'll bake down from the other layer. If you want to, if you don't have a high poly, low poly, and just want to bake down something from an object straight out to the UVs without baking from one object to another, you can just bake the render outputs, and then it just renders the surface, which is handy for example, even baking things like ambient occlusion on a low poly object. But you can also bake to an image. So if you go to the image, I'm just going to drag in a checker texture here. Just drag it in here, random checker, and if this one is set to, for example, the UV map, and the one we used, and then it's set to diffuse color, then it will bake down the diffuse color. So, and then you can just pick. Let's see if we can get this menu. Bake to texture, or bake from object to texture. Bake the file, and you can save out a copy here, or just, and then it bakes out whatever channel this texture was in. And that's the very basics of how you bake things, and the end of my quick overview, and I hope you liked it.